Hello everyone, welcome to Secura webinar. My name is Yulia Plivaka. I'm an account manager of product manufacturers group at Secura, and today I will be your host for this webinar. Today we will talk about the UNECE Cybersecurity R155 regulation for the automotive suppliers. I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Razvan Venter, Group Manager Product Manufacturers at Secura. This presentation will be followed by a Q&A session, so feel free to leave your questions in the chat and we will address them at the end of the webinar. Let's start with a few words about Secura. Secura is a Dutch security expert with more than 20 years of experience on the security market. Our approach is to link different international standards, metrics, and certification schemes, as well as to focus on all aspects such as people, processes, and technology. We are trying to envision our services as shown on this diagram. It's covering IT, OT, and IoT for different domains such as public, finance, technology, industrial, and product manufacturers. The team, Razvan and I, are from our product manufacturers, and our services include testing, evaluation, and certification in line with internationally recognized standards and regulation for various products such as medical devices, industrial, network devices, automotive, and others. And now it's time to move to the presentation. Razvan, you're welcome to start.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Yulia. And thanks everyone for joining into this webinar, where indeed we will talk about especially the cybersecurity regulation from UNECE, Regulation 155, but especially from the point of view of vehicle component suppliers, component manufacturers. So this is the agenda that we have on our list for today, with a few topics that we propose to you over the next approximately 30 minutes. We'll start with a bit of an introduction about the UNECE and the landscape, the world of vehicle regulations which are being managed by UNECE. We'll spend a few minutes talking about the main contents of Regulation 155, the regulation for cybersecurity, and we'll try to see what are the main parts, the main chapters, and roughly what kind of evidence would vehicle manufacturers need to prepare. Yes, vehicle manufacturers, because the regulation we'll see is for vehicle manufacturers. However, the regulation itself will be very important for component suppliers as well. And then in the third part of the presentation, we'll switch our focus towards the suppliers of components or services for automotive, and we'll talk about the practical impact, the important things that suppliers will need to keep into account, and also what do they have to prepare in order to make sure that they are compliant whenever the request from the vehicle manufacturer comes. Of course, at the end, we'll make sure to keep enough time for questions and answers. So feel free to type your questions in the question box in GoToWebinar throughout the whole presentation if you wish. And by the end of the session, we'll make time to go through your questions. So that being said, let's get started with the first topic on our agenda, in which we'll discuss a bit about UNECE and about automotive regulations. So UNECE, standing for the United Nations Economic Commission of Europe, is a worldwide organization that is busy with actually quite a few things. Among others is also the task of drafting, coordinating, and managing vehicle regulations and imposing those vehicle regulations on a set of countries which have decided to adopt those regulations. Of course, it's interesting how it works in the world of automotive homologation and recognition, because of course, from a point of view of the vehicle manufacturer, it will be very inefficient if they have to type approve their product, their vehicle, in each and every country where they want to enter with their vehicles. So that's why UNECE has put already a long time ago the basis of an agreement. It's called the 1958 agreement, and all the countries which are members of this agreement all recognize each other's homologations. So as a vehicle manufacturer, if you are type approving your vehicle, your car, bus, and so on, in any of those countries of the 1958 agreement, then all the others will directly recognize the type which has been approved, and then a vehicle manufacturer can place the vehicles on each of those countries. On this slide, we see with the red the countries which are members of the 1958 agreement. So we see a distribution that covers most of Europe, but also other countries like outside the European Union, like UK, for example, some parts of Africa, Australia, and also countries in Asia, such as Japan and South Korea, among others. Now, how come we have recently seen in the last couple of years an increasing focus from UNECE on the topic of cybersecurity, but also software updates, in fact? And it goes very much in line, of course, with the current period that we're living. If we think about the past, UNECE regulations have always gone hand in hand with the demands of a particular decade, such that we had in the past regulations about emissions, about safety mostly. And right now, in the last few years, in the last decade mostly, we really see modern vehicles as, I guess we can call them computers on wheels. They have so many interfaces, quite an extensive set of interfaces, which are not even optional anymore. They're the kind of default in modern vehicles. And I'm talking about Bluetooth, wireless, USB, serial, but also more sophisticated ones like vehicle to vehicle or vehicle to infrastructure, keyless entry, and so on. So all those kind of new features, those kind of new interfaces are becoming the norm, default in modern vehicles. And of course, whenever you introduce a new interface or a new functionality, you also open the avenue for potential vulnerabilities, which can be exploited on a vehicle. And of course, in the last few years, we had some practical examples of attacks that have been attempted in practice. The picture here on the screen is from a relatively famous attack on a Jeep vehicle performed a few years ago, but there were some others as well that have been demonstrated. So all of those put together resulted in a pretty high interest from UNECE to focus their attention on this topic and work towards drafting and making mandatory the Regulation 155 on cybersecurity. So talking about Regulation 155, let's spend the next few moments on trying to understand a bit how the regulation looks like, what you can find inside, and what are the most important parts of this regulation. To start with the scope is very critical, and it also relates very much with the topic of this webinar because we wanted to focus it from the perspective of vehicle suppliers. Well, an important thing to keep in mind is that the regulation is drafted for vehicle manufacturers. So we have a few categories of vehicles which are in the scope of the regulation. You can think about vehicles used for transport of passengers, like cars, for example, vehicle used for transport of goods, like trucks, but also connected trailers. And of course, all of those types of vehicles are products that a vehicle manufacturer is putting together and placing on the market. So then, how come we have the interest on the supplier area as well? Well, of course, we'll talk much more about it in the next part of this webinar. But in principle, vehicle manufacturers, they are in the scope of the regulation. However, the regulation is asking them to reach out to their supply chain and make sure that the supply chain integrates sufficient security controls and measures into their products as well. So that's how the connection is being made. Now, if we look at the structure of the regulation, we will see directly just by scrolling through the table of contents pretty much that is split into two main parts. The so-called cybersecurity management system, which is dealing with the processes that a vehicle manufacturer needs to have in place, and also the vehicle type requirements, which are more technical requirements linked with the architecture, the technical design, and evidence of a vehicle itself, or vehicle type itself. One more important remark is that the regulation does address the whole life cycle of the vehicle. So we are taking into scope aspects such as the development phase, but also post-development, such as maintenance, production, all the way to removal from service. So the whole life cycle, the whole life of a vehicle will be in the scope of the regulation, and we'll see that most of those processes are being spread across the whole life cycle. We introduced already the topic of the cybersecurity management system, which is focused on processes indeed. So basically, before we go ahead and we can talk about a secure vehicle type, or an EE architecture, what the regulation asks from the OEMs is that the set of procedures and processes behind the development of the vehicle itself exists, is mature, documented, and is good enough in order to ensure that the vehicle can be constructed in a secure manner. So the whole CSMS part will focus on this topic, and the vehicle manufacturers, in fact, need to get their CSMS certified before they can apply to a vehicle type evaluation and to a vehicle type approval. An approved CSMS will result in a CSMS certificate of compliance, which is valid for 3 years. And on top of this certificate of compliance, vehicle manufacturers can go ahead and approve their vehicle types. So let's take a brief look at what kind of processes are being captured under the CSMS, because this will also link very strongly with the rest of our story when we talk about suppliers. and what is the relation with R155. We see a few types of requirements. We typically group them into 4 categories. And the first one are requirements linked with processes for security management and governance. What does that mean? Well, it means that the vehicle manufacturers will need to have in place procedures based on which they define roles, tasks, and responsibilities among the organization, but also they manage to keep track of relevant skills and competences of all the people who are involved in the processes, either from a management perspective or from a vehicle development and production perspective. All this needs to be documented and followed. The second category is maybe even more interesting because it gets a bit more technical. Here we're talking about risk management. And risk management is, of course, a pretty sophisticated story because there are a few things that fall under this umbrella. We're talking about process for identifying risks applicable to vehicle types, but also, of course, the sub-units, the subsystems of the vehicle type, how they are rating, prioritizing, and analyzing those risks. But of course, what to do after you identify the risks. So how do you define security mitigations or controls in order to mitigate those risks? Of course, ultimately, how do you deal with the residual risk, how to calculate the residual risk, and what to do, whether that's sufficiently low to accept it, or otherwise if more work needs to be done in terms of defining security controls. So risk management is a topic that vehicle manufacturers in particular will have to treat very carefully, and it links very much with the story on the supply chain, which we'll see in a couple of moments. But first, to finish our scroll through the types of processes, we can go to the next category, which is typically a type of process more relevant to the post-development phase in production and in post-production. And here I'm talking about the part which is linked with dealing with security incidents and security vulnerabilities. When a vehicle exits the factory, it might be free from existing vulnerabilities because all of those have been mitigated. However, new incidents and new vulnerabilities are published on a very constant basis. So the OEM will need to have a process in place in order to be able to identify those kind of new risks, incidents, or vulnerabilities. But of course, equally important to be able to react to those kind of new incidents or vulnerabilities. Like I said, especially during production and post-production. And finally, how this whole story comes together and how suppliers are being dragged into the discussion. There is one particular requirement, in fact, in the regulation. It's requirement 7225, which asks the vehicle manufacturer, the OEM, to be in control and to take the responsibility for the security of their suppliers, of the companies involved in their supply chain. And here, of course, we can talk about tier 1, tier 2, and beyond suppliers. So what does that mean in terms of the agreement? We'll talk a bit more from now on in this webinar, but in practice, vehicle manufacturers will need to make sure that they collect sufficient evidence in terms of contractual agreements with the suppliers, and also after the agreements are being signed and agreed, then they collect the necessary evidence which will demonstrate that the suppliers are taking security seriously and that security has been integrated into the product, component, or service that they are offering. One more remark in this part of the presentation about vehicle type. We will not spend too much time talking about vehicle type because that was in the scope of some other previous webinars. However, for a vehicle manufacturer, after they have their CSMS in place and everything is being handled well from a process perspective, the vehicle type part of the regulation is pretty much making sure that the new vehicle architecture, which is being developed and produced, simply follows the development, production, and post-production processes which were approved as part of the CSMS. And as long as that is being done and sufficient evidence is collected, either generated by the manufacturer or from the supply chain, then the OEM should be good to go for type approval and, of course, type certification. So that's in a nutshell what especially vehicle manufacturers can expect when they go through this regulation and when they prepare for approval, either for their CSMS or for the vehicle type. And we already noticed that there is one particular requirement that asks them to pay special attention to their suppliers, to the supply chain. So let's now steer this discussion into the topic of the suppliers, and let's spend the second part of the webinar talking about what does it really mean practically from the point of view of vehicle components and services suppliers' point of view. We already mentioned before that the regulation applies to vehicle manufacturers. So this is very interesting, and in the past couple of years, it did spark quite a few discussions, especially from the supply chain, on what does that mean? Does it mean that suppliers can simply ignore the regulation for now because they're not in scope? Or does it mean that they are somehow indirectly required to comply with the regulation? and is it with the whole regulation or only with a part of the regulation? And to be honest, those were all very deep and very good questions that had to be addressed seriously, both by the UNECE task force, which was in charge of drafting the regulation, as well as all the other companies, labs, OEMs, and so on, which were involved in the group that was providing feedback to those regulations. It was a pretty important question because, of course, in practice, we know that the automotive vertical, the automotive domain, is one of the domains that relies maybe the most on a supply chain. A vehicle manufacturer typically is a large integrator of components, and those components are all coming from other parts, from other suppliers. So it was becoming pretty obvious that the regulation should be important for the suppliers as well, even though they are not in scope. So how the connection is being made is that even though manufacturers are the ones who have to get certified and have to get compliant, still the regulation asks manufacturers to proactively reach out to their supply chain, to their suppliers, and make sure that the suppliers have understood the requirements and are providing back to the manufacturers sufficient proof, sufficient evidence of how are they incorporating security into their offered goods or services. So now let's talk about what is that evidence, because of course so far we have been pretty vague, pretty high level in terms of what the evidence is, but now we can spend a few more minutes into trying to explain what kind of evidence the suppliers need to provide. We have mentioned already before that the regulation consists of two parts, the CSMS assessment and a vehicle type assessment. For a CSMS, we'll see that suppliers need to provide some processes, and the good news from their point of view is that the set of procedures that they have to provide is a bit less than what the OEMs themselves have to provide. However, there are a few items that the suppliers need to pay attention to. And then, especially from a vehicle type assessment perspective, suppliers will have probably an interesting challenge in making sure that they interact with the OEMs and they can compile together with the OEMs the necessary set of technical documentation, including we'll see soon risk assessment, testing, and incident information, security incident information. Talking about the expectations, when we see the regulation itself, like I mentioned before, there is one requirement only that asks about the OEMs to reach out to the suppliers. However, that requirement does point to another requirement, which is the 7222 part of the regulation, if you are willing to check it afterwards. And that requirement is the one in which all the main processes are clustered. So basically, what is being expected from the suppliers is pretty much to follow all the main procedures that are being asked for the vehicle manufacturers and provide also a copy of how they are complying themselves with those procedures. So there are a few things that suppliers need to care about, and those are summarized a bit in this diagram. Contractual evidence with the vehicle manufacturer is very important. We'll have some examples on the next slides. Also some technical evidence in terms of how the risk assessment was done, what kind of risks were identified in the components or in the services which are offered by the suppliers. That's also very important, and it could become a relatively extensive part, especially if the scope of items offered by the suppliers is large. And then there will be a bit of a back and forth interaction and periodic set of evidence that suppliers need to provide, because you can imagine in the beginning, the manufacturers will ask you for the evidence, let's say at moment zero. So what is the set of risks? What is the set of security controls, testing results at moment zero? And based on that evidence, the manufacturers will get type approved. So that's great. However, security is never a one-time activity. It's more of a continuous process, because there are always design updates, there are always new vulnerabilities, there are always new incidents. So that's why vehicle manufacturers will need to stay in a continuous relation with their supply chain and make sure that whenever something new happens, either from the manufacturer side or from the supplier side, sufficient updated evidence is being collected, and manufacturers can stay in control of the services and components of their suppliers. So we did talk before about contract clauses. That becomes one of the major parts of the evidence that suppliers need to agree and provide to the vehicle manufacturers. Here, the interpretation will also be strongly dependent on different type approval authorities. However, most of the type approval authorities agree that cybersecurity needs to be stipulated and included as part of the contractual agreements between the OEM and the supply chain. And here, of course, by taking a look at the requirements in section 7222, we can see what kind of contractual agreements do the manufacturers need to put in place with the suppliers. And we see that the list is not terribly long. However, we all know how it goes typically when we try to negotiate contractual parts. It can be a bit of a longer process, so that's why it's always a good idea to start in time and leave room for those kind of negotiations or multiple rounds of contracting versions. In terms of clauses that typically should be included into contract, into set of contracts, we can think about agreements on security training and governance on the supplier side. So how does the supplier deal with keeping track of their roles, responsibilities, skills, and knowledge? Then, of course, agreement on providing input whenever there are new updates to the design. That's critical for the vehicle manufacturer because the supplier will have to inform them whenever there are some new changes, either in software or hardware, and then also inform them about what are the design changes. The vehicle manufacturers will then take this information and probably include it into their risk assessment and conclude if there are any new risks as a result of design updates. Risk assessment results and testing evidence, that's also very important because the suppliers, they are really in control of their own design, right? So they know what's inside the component, what's inside the service. So they are the ones who are most in measure to perform the risk assessment, identify the risks, identify the controls, and also perform the testing and validation on those controls. Otherwise, the mission of the vehicle manufacturer will be much more challenging. The last two are about security monitoring and incident response. Of course, very important. From an incident response perspective, the vehicle manufacturers will be more or less blind to what happens with the services offered by the suppliers. They don't know when an incident has happened. So the suppliers need to inform them if something bad happens, what was the impact, what are the expectations, and how to solve out the whole issue. And the same from a security monitoring perspective. If there's a new vulnerability that the suppliers considers to be relevant, then they have to provide this kind of information to the vehicle manufacturer. That's from a point of view of contractual clauses. And now we can switch to the second category, where we talk about evidence, more concrete, hard, technical evidence that the suppliers need to provide to the OEMs. And here we're talking about the list of risks that have been identified by the suppliers for their component or for their service. So it can be either risks linked to the hardware device itself, think about an ECU, for example, but also keep in mind that also other services like cloud connections or software update interfaces and so on, which are more software products, software services, they will probably also be in the scope of R155 because they include security features for the vehicle. And most likely there will be risks linked with those kind of services or products as well. So a list of risks and a list of also accepted or residual risks will need to be provided to the vehicle manufacturers. Testing evidence, that becomes very important, especially for lower tier suppliers, I would say, because vehicle manufacturers will probably have a very hard time performing testing on more of a chip level or so. So providing some testing and validation information or otherwise a recognized certification for those products will become quite important for the OEMs. Then we switch again to the topic of vulnerabilities and incidents. And for every new vulnerability or for every new incident, the suppliers are expected to be transparent about it and to provide information about what has happened and what are the expectations that the OEM needs now to do in order to mitigate together with the supplier this incident or this vulnerability. And finally, we did discuss before about governance, structure, and competences. Well, also some evidence to describe a certain governance structure or some examples of trainings or some examples of skills, competences matrices need to be provided or made available by the suppliers. And that's it pretty much. But of course, it doesn't look like a very easy story. There are some contractual agreements and there is a set of evidence that will need to be provided. In practice, from our experience, it seems that many times this will result in quite a longer interaction between the manufacturer and its set of suppliers. Some general advice, we always recommend to suppliers to start the discussions with the OEMs as early as possible. That's well, probably a typical best practice not only in cybersecurity and not only in automotive, but given the fact that an OEM will typically have a range of suppliers in the order of maybe dozens or even hundreds, just imagine that they will have to go through those processes over and over again, and their capacity will also be limited. They're just a certain number of people. So making sure that all those contracts and all this evidence have been agreed and collected in time will become quite critical. Otherwise, there might be delays, there might be things might need to be rescheduled. So start discussing, start to approach them as early as possible. Most likely they will also try to approach you and try to scope out what are the expectations in terms of contracts and in terms of evidence, because working on contracts will probably not be a single round story. Typically there's some negotiations, there's some reviews, they have to go through legal departments. It does take a while, so leave room for that. Working on the evidence for the regulation, we briefly mentioned about the expected evidence on the previous slide, but even if it doesn't look terribly complicated, it will take a bit of time to perform the TARA on the components itself, the threat assessment, the risk assessment. It will take maybe a bit of time to perform the testing evidence. So make sure to accommodate some time, to accommodate some room for those activities as well. Those were some general pieces of advice. Of course, we did mention before about the types of evidence. There were a bunch of such evidence, of such concrete pieces of documentation. I would like to zoom in on two of them in particular because they are typically more interesting, or maybe sometimes they require a bit more time, a bit more effort from the supplier side. And those two topics that we'll discuss over those next two slides are risk management evidence and security testing evidence. So to start with risk management, as we can see in this diagram where we have risk management in the center and a few other topics all around, we see that it's not a very straightforward topic. Suppliers will need to perform the scoping, the security scoping of their product. So what are the security relevant parts and assets and so on. Then define the threats, and they will have to do it by keeping Annex 5 of R155 in mind, because that's a baseline of threats which the regulation is pointing to. They will have to define attack paths. They will have to start rating those attacks and end up with rated risks. They will have to see how they mitigate the risks, and ultimately how they accept and how they validate the residual risks and the set of defined security controls. So we see that there are quite a few activities that need to be scheduled, that need to be performed. They do take a bit of time, depending, of course, on the complexity of the product. Maybe for a simple ECU, it will not be too much, but if we're talking about a more complex set of ECUs, like a small system, for example, or if we think about more of a cloud service or another type of service or application, well, it could get as complex as possible up to some extent. So keep in mind that all those things will need to be addressed. And here's where we get a bit of a helping hand from the industry, because the colleagues from ISO have been working also quite a lot in the last couple of years on drafting the so-called ISO SAE 2144 standard. It became public beginning of last year. And this standard was really defined to make a helping tool for both manufacturers of vehicles, but also for manufacturers of components, in order to understand better the regulation and make it a bit more concrete in terms of what needs to be done, what are the actual deliverables that should be in place. Risk management has an important chapter in the standard. It's chapter 15, so feel free to check it. And it really explains in a pretty practical way, pretty clear way, what needs to be done and what kind of work products, deliverables will need to be prepared in order to have a complete risk assessment, a complete risk management file. And then you can just share that file with the vehicle manufacturer, and most likely it's going to be sufficient. So it's a helpful approach which we typically recommend to our suppliers. Now, if we take a look at the testing part, testing should be focused from a supplier perspective simply on the fact that all the security controls inside need to be validated. We're not talking about extensive penetration testing, but sufficient validation testing just to confirm that there are no obvious vulnerabilities inside, and the fact that all the controls work as they are expected. That will be sufficient, at least for the beginning, to comply with the regulation. And keep in mind that also the technical service, which will perform the testing and review and certification, will like to retest some of those features. So the testing results therefore need to be correct and true, because the technical service will sample them and will retest some of those features. But that's what we can typically expect from a point of view of testing evidence, testing and validation. So now, once we've gone through those two items in a more zoomed in approach, a bit of advice. Of course, the advice again starts with taking sufficient time, taking a fair amount of time. Don't assume that it's going to be too easy. Hopefully it will be, not too complicated, but it could happen that you need to go through a few rounds of risk assessment, especially if you identify some risks which need to be treated. That could take a bit of time. So especially if you are doing it on a more complex scope, or especially if you're doing it as a supplier for the first time, it could be, then it might take a decent amount of time. So make sure to reserve this time margin, have a good interaction with the OEM, keep in touch with what are their expectations and what do you plan to deliver and what could be maybe possible limitations in this process. That's also going to be at some point quite essential. Reserve time for updates in case some of those risks require mitigations, which need to be either hardware or software. Reserve, of course, time for it. Especially hardware updates don't happen overnight, as we all know, so probably there's going to be a bit of a time period which will be required from the suppliers to implement those changes. And ultimately, keep in mind ISO 214. That's something that we always recommend, especially to suppliers, in order to perform a complete and thorough risk assessment and also testing and validation set of activities. So now that we've been through all those parts of the presentation, let's try to draw some conclusions before we move to questions and answers. So we've seen a few things. We've seen the basic requirements that are included in the regulation. We talked then a bit more about what are the expectations from a supply chain in terms of evidence, contractual agreements, and so on. And then we try to zoom in on more, let's call them use cases, which are focused especially on risk assessment and on testing evidence. We also try to give some advice, some recommendations. So again, to summarize maybe on those pieces of advice, I would like to reiterate that time is essential. In the vehicle manufacturer and in automotive industry in general, there's a strong dependency between OEMs and suppliers, and every piece of delay would be critical. There's no, from our experience, there's no such thing as an acceptable delay. It's always too late. So making sure that you start in time, you start to approach the OEMs, or you react to their own approach attempts, discussing about the expectations, discussing about timelines, about contractual agreements, and so on. That will be quite essential. Then reserve time and reserve bandwidth capacity on your side as a supplier for generating and compiling all this evidence. On one hand, I can imagine that the legal department will be involved in all the contract clauses negotiations. On the other hand, of course, the technical teams, the development teams will be involved for performing risk assessments, TARAs, testing, validation, and reports. So it's going to be a bit of a collective effort, and this effort will probably take a bit of time. And of course, be prepared for discussions. Most likely, it's not going to be a one-shot activity. Probably you'll end up with some versions, which then the OEMs will review. Maybe there's going to be feedback. Maybe they want slightly different approach or slightly different results. So be prepared for discussions. The regulation is new, and is new for everyone, of course, for both OEMs as well as for suppliers. Most likely, if we have this discussion in 5 years from now, it's going to become a lot more clearer what are the expectations and what is the bottom line, what is sufficient. But for now, we have an interpretation document, and everyone is trying to follow it as closely as possible. But the interpretation document, as the name says, leaves room to interpretation. So be prepared to discussions with the OEMs and make sure that you have sufficient time to understand each other and understand the expectations on both sides. In terms of timelines, the regulation, the R155, is already into force. It has been into force from beginning of last year. And in the European Union, it will become mandatory for new vehicle types from July this year. So just 2 more months to go, and the regulation would become mandatory for every new vehicle type that a manufacturer is introducing on the European market. Pay attention to the fact that some countries, like Japan, for example, has already made the regulation mandatory for vehicle types, for new vehicle types, already from last year. So if you're planning to, or if you're already working with some OEMs who are selling in Japan, they might need this kind of evidence in terms of risk, contracts, testing, and so on straight away, because whenever they place a new vehicle on the market, then they have to have this evidence in place. So those timelines are the ones to keep in mind. And that being said, we're getting close to the end of our program for today. I think we all share the view that we have an interesting set of times ahead. The 2 regulations have been drafted for a few years now. We're now getting close to the point where they become mandatory. So of course, high expectations from all sides. We're all very curious to see what will happen with the approval authorities, with the vehicle manufacturers, with the supply chain. How will everyone react to this new regulation on cybersecurity? We at Secura, we have been trying to follow the story as close as we could over the last few years. Currently, we are a recognized technical service under 2 approval authorities in the Netherlands and in Cyprus. and our service offering, which is designed to come in support of both vehicle manufacturers, OEMs, and suppliers, includes services like trainings, pre-audits, pre-gap analysis, potential consultancy with addressing the gaps, and of course, official audits and certification for R155, but also for R156 in terms of software updates. So feel free to reach out to both Yulia and myself, and we're happy to help you further, or just have a chat with you and learn more about your interest or about your needs. Also, feel free to check our website, where we have a bunch of interesting materials. You can also find recordings of old webinars there on the same topic, on similar topics, but also some white papers and some fact sheets, which are aimed to explain more about the content of the regulation and how to interpret this regulation on cybersecurity from the vehicle manufacturer and from the supplier perspective. And also, of course, stay tuned for our future webinars, which will happen later this year on the same topic. And finally, I would like to remind you once again about possible services that we can offer to interested parties, either vehicle manufacturers or suppliers of components, which include options for training for R155, but also for ISO 2144, of course, gap analysis, certification, official certification for ISO 2144, and official audits and certification for UNECE R155, CSMS, and vehicle types. And on that note, I would like to now switch the discussion towards the questions and answers. And well, thank you very much for staying tuned and staying with us for the last half an hour. So if there are questions at this point, we can try to address them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Razvan, for this presentation. We do indeed have some questions, so we can move to them. And if you still have more questions, feel free to send them in. The first question is, where is it possible to find more details about the contract clauses, because they couldn't find them in R155?
Yeah, that's a good question. In R155, you're not going to find too much. The regulation is intended to be made as high level and as well, I would like to avoid the word vague, but as high level as possible. There is a so-called interpretation document, which is also an official document published by WP29 in UNECE. The intention of this interpretation document is to give a bit more clarity on the clauses. That being said, you're not going to find straight away all the answers you're looking for. There's still some room for interpretation in the document itself. However, you can find some direction in that document over what kind of contractual clauses should be included into the discussions with the OEMs. And ultimately, what we always recommend is that both OEMs as well as suppliers reach out to their local approval authority in case there are some questions or some doubts, because the local approval authority will be the one able to provide some more clarity in terms of what they really expect to see in practice. So that's what we would recommend in this case.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question. From your perspective, what is the relation between the ISO 21434 and the IATF 16949, if any?
That's a good question, and I might have to do some more checking, especially on the second standard, because we haven't spent yet too much time in exploring that one. Of course, the relation between ISO 2144 and the R155 is pretty straightforward. In fact, the latest version of the interpretation document for R155 provides a direct link to some requirements in ISO 2144. So there's definitely a strong connection there, a strong mapping. About the IATF publication that you referred to, let me please take this question offline, and I will come back to you after we get more insight on what that document refers to.
Okay, thanks. Next question is the WP 0603 is a cybersecurity assessment report. What is the difference between this WP and the TARA?
Again, an interesting question, because we're I guess the question refers to one particular work package in ISO 2144. I'll have to double check that particular requirement in more detail to see what the requirement is asking for. But the cybersecurity assessment report, from our current understanding of ISO 2144, is asking for a set of security controls which are being in place, and also how those controls are being validated. This is typically the last part of the TARA, because the TARA starts with a threat analysis, in which you define the threats, you define the risks, you define the attack scenarios, and then of course the next part is how do you mitigate those risks. And that's where you're going to start defining your controls, explaining your controls, And ultimately, once the controls are in place, you need to also validate them. You need to make sure that the controls are indeed the correct ones. So that's where the cybersecurity validation and assessment comes into play, and that's the topic on which this particular requirement and work product is referring to. It's simply after you have the controls defined, you have to validate them either by testing or by design review and store that validation information, because, by the way, it's going to also be required to be sent to the vehicle manufacturers.
Okay, thank you. And we will address one more question. So as a suppliers, we work with multiple OEMs. What would be a good approach for addressing the expectation of all the OEMs with the least amount of effort?
Yeah. That's a question that I can imagine many suppliers will have, because it's quite common in automotive for a supplier, and we all know that there are some companies who are quite well known in the field, and they have multiple customers in terms of vehicle manufacturers. And of course, what you want to avoid as a supplier is that you have to perform the same story over and over again for every manufacturer. That's going to be an interminable effort. So of course, there probably will be in practice some slight differences from manufacturer to manufacturer, and in terms of contractual agreements, for example, I can imagine that this is a discussion that needs to be take place with every manufacturer in particular. But in terms of testing evidence and technical evidence, our recommendation is try to follow ISO 2144, get your evidence file in place for risk assessment, for testing, for assessment of controls, and just keep it as a file for your product or for your service. And well, simply reuse that file with every manufacturer to whom you're providing that particular component. That should be good enough. So in our view, that's an efficient way to make the mission more manageable and avoid a repetition of effort.
Okay, thank you very much. That were all the questions for today. And thanks for everyone who attended today's webinar. Hope you found it useful and interesting. And we will really appreciate if you could fill up our survey form that will be prompted right after you leave the webinar. Thanks again, everyone, and have a nice day. We hope to see you in the next webinar.
Thank you as well, Julia, and thanks everyone for joining in. I hope you found it insightful. Feel free to reach out to us if there are some more questions, and looking forward to talk to you once again next time. Have a nice day.